Good evening, Father.
Thank you very much, Father, for that kind introduction. I'm not here to tell you about any of those things. Let's talk about something else. This evening's talk is entitled, As Known and Yet Well Known, Introducing the Orthodox Church in American Culture. The first time I gave this talk, the date was February 14th. I was honored that my hosts set aside the romantic customs traditional for that evening on the calendar to come and to listen. It is, of course, the most romantic of all days of the year, a day dedicated to love, romance, affection, care for one another. It is a day filled with roses and chocolates, clumsily written love poems, pink and red hearts. It is also a day where perhaps the more historically minded among us may begin to think about a particular saint and wonder how it is that his name is somehow what inspires all of this late winter ardor and romance. Yes, I'll never forget that very happy St. Auxentius Day. Oh, perhaps you thought I was going to mention St. Valentine. Well, he's not on the Orthodox calendar of saints until July 30th. Actually, the Orthodox do have a St. Valentine on the calendar for February 14th, but he's not the same St. Valentine that Western Christians celebrate on that day. At least probably not. They could be the same man, but most likely one was a priest and the other a bishop. But he's not the main commemoration for February 14th in any event. That is St. Auxentius. Of course, if you're on the old calendar, you'll have to wait another 13 days to celebrate St. Auxentius, because the date on your calendar would be February 1st, which is dedicated to Saint Trypho. And none of these saints particularly inspires pink hearts, Hallmark cards, and candy giving for the Orthodox. And that is roughly how the first encounter with Orthodox Christianity goes for most Americans. It seems to start with something familiar, and then, no, it's not the same, and then this is complicated. I recall a story I once heard about a woman who came to a wedding at the church where I first discovered the Orthodox faith. The reception was going to be fairly small and actually was a potluck dinner rather than a catered one. This guest had brought with her a large platter of some sort of pork dish. After the wedding, she set down her dish in the parish hall next to the church, and as she did so, she suddenly looked up in horror at one of the parishioners standing in front of her, and she exclaimed, "Oh no, you people can't eat this, can you?" Somehow, she had attended an Orthodox Christian wedding in an Orthodox Christian church, replete with large images of Jesus all around, filled with multiple liturgical references to Jesus Christ as God, and nevertheless had come away with the idea that we were Jews, and that she had therefore offended our kosher sensibilities. But probably the most common misconception about Orthodox Christians that we hear is that one must be a member of a particular ethnic group in order to participate. I've actually been asked if it is required to be Greek in order to join my church. And just for the record, while we do have some Greeks in my parish, they are a minority of the congregation. And the film, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, did not help us in this regard. Especially when one of the protagonists gets baptized into the church and then declares, and I weep every time I think of this, "I'm Greek now." We also don't seem to catch much exposure by means of the better-known members of our faith. People you've likely heard of, such as actors Jennifer Aniston, real last name Anastasakis, Jim and John Belushi, Albanians, Tina Fey, her real name is Stamatina, Jamie Farr, real name Jamil Farah, singer George Michael, political commentator George Stephanopoulos, his father's a priest and his sister's a nun, tennis players Pete Sampras and Novak Djokovic, former CIA Director George Tenet, scientist Nikola Tesla, Republican National Committee Chairman Reince Priebus, Congressman Justin Amash. All of these people were raised as Orthodox Christians. Not to mention actor Tom Hanks, football player Troy Polamalu, rock singers Chris Cornell and Dave Gahan, lead singers respectively of Soundgarden and Depeche Mode. MTV VJ Kennedy, everyone remember her from the 90s? And General Hospital soap opera star Jonathan Jackson, all of whom have converted to Orthodoxy. And since Jonathan is a friend of mine, I have to mention that this evening he has a new show that premieres called Nashville. Thus, when the Orthodox are even heard of at all in American culture, we may call to mind the words of the Apostle Paul in the 6th chapter of his 2nd epistle to the Corinthians, as unknown and yet well known. There is something familiar about Orthodoxy to Americans, but we don't seem to be what they expect. We are not very well known. Some hear the word Orthodox and therefore expect Jews, despite the fact that even the biggest estimates of Orthodox Judaism put its worldwide population at less than 6 million, while conservative estimates of Orthodox Christians number around 250 million. Some hear the word Christian, therefore expect either Roman Catholicism, perhaps because they see a clergyman in robes, or Protestantism, because we mentioned that we're not Roman Catholic and have a married priesthood, or perhaps just because they think that all Christians are the same and have the same basic theology with only minor variations. So what I propose to attempt to offer this evening is a short stroll through a selection of elements of the Orthodox Christian faith that may present themselves as unknown and yet well-known. Places where we have significant differences and yet similarities with the Christians who may be more familiar to Americans. First, however, we will consider some brief historical backgrounds to give some sense of what the larger narrative is. Where did the Orthodox come from? What is their relation to other Christian communities? It is a sad reality that most Americans, if they know any Christian history, have probably gotten it from sources like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And while the novel and the film based on it are interesting bits of fiction, they are just that, fiction. Any first semester student of Christian history can tell you that, despite what the book says on the inside cover, the historical claims made in it are mostly bunk. For instance, the book claims that the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian church, which met in the year 325, invented the doctrine of Jesus being God. And while this claim appeals to modern skeptics of Christianity who may accept Jesus as a man, but have a tough time with his being God, it reveals a deep ignorance of history. Nicaea did indeed debate the divinity of Jesus, but the claim that he is God was not new there. Indeed, there was something new, and that was the claim that he was not God. In fact, most of the doctrinal debates of the first 3 centuries of Christianity were not about whether he was truly God, but whether he was truly human. The 4th through 8th centuries saw more doctrinal debates, mostly about what it means that Jesus is fully human. I'm now going to attempt to give you a basic narrative for 2,000 years of Christian history, particularly focused on the question of where the different Christian churches come from, all in the space of about 5 minutes. So I'll have to get a drink of this. Please do not time me. So how did we get here? Generally speaking, most Christians were all members of a single church for roughly 1,000 years, from the time of Christ's resurrection from the dead until about the middle of the 11th century. Yes, there are plenty of little schisms here and there, even from the time of the apostles, but with a few notable exceptions, there were no truly major competing Christian churches. Most Christians belonged to a single church that traced its roots directly to the apostles and whose leaders stood in a direct historical succession from the apostles. They were focused in 5 great spiritual cities: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. These 5 great churches together formed one Christian church, and they shared the same doctrine, the same beliefs, and the same spiritual life, without any changes in substance since the time of the apostles. These churches were led by bishops. Their worship life was liturgical, involving detailed, meaningful, and highly symbolic rituals whose sacraments were understood as truly conveying God's grace to the believer. It was during this period, specifically in the late 4th century, that the canon of the New Testament came to be formed. First written down by the Bishop of Alexandria in the year 367, St. Athanasius the Great. That list from 367 is the earliest list of the 27 books of the New Testament as we now know it. But the Christian Church somehow functioned for more than 300 years without the ability to ask itself, what does the Bible say? Think about that for just a second. Over 300 years without a recognizable New Testament. In the 11th century, issues that had been simmering for some time in the back burner came to a boil between the churches of Rome and Constantinople. And Rome broke communion with Constantinople, and then Constantinople returned the favor and broke communion with Rome. At issue is primarily whether Rome's bishop, the Pope, should be considered the ruler of all bishops rather than simply the most senior. Rome said yes, Constantinople said no. Eventually, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem all clearly said no too, and so communion was broken between them and Rome as well. And from that time on, we can clearly see the independent formation of the Roman Catholic Church, with the Pope as its absolute head. The other churches which remained together and continued in the old way of seeing all bishops as essentially equal are now known as the Orthodox Church, sometimes called the Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox Church. Later, in the 16th century, an Augustinian monk in Germany by the name of Martin Luther famously protested against various abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, most especially the sale of indulgences to get believers out of purgatory, but also against the absolute authority of the Pope, and some other matters. His publication of 95 theses against the claims of the Pope was the moment that began the Protestant Reformation, a major breakup of Christianity in Western Europe. Within a generation, there came to be multiple Protestant factions.